everybody. Welcome to Confluence. Thanks, everybody, for coming. We are very fortunate to have Simon Miles with us tonight. Just as a side, we have lots of events coming up here. We're going to make sure that Simon comes back again and again. What we're doing is trying to support all the local artists and authors as they present their material and as they support us, as they have been. So it's really, really, really nice. So that's what we're doing here. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Simon Miles because I am anxious to hear what he's got to say.
Well, thank you very much, René, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight. It's lovely to see such lovely smiling faces in this beautiful salon, which is, I think, absolutely delightful. So thank you to Confluence, Jill and René for hosting this tonight, and thank you all for coming out on this rainy Friday night. Well, my talk tonight is called Le Serpent Rouge and the Zodiac of Rennes-les-Bains. Part one is called Le Serpent Rouge. But probably most people in the room have heard of it, but let's start at the beginning and explain what Le Serpent Rouge is. Le Serpent Rouge is a poem, an enigmatic poem, on a mysterious poem. It was published nearly 60 years ago. It appeared in a pamphlet of about 16 pages long. It was deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris in 1967, as is required legally of every book published in France. Now, it was definitely part of a series of publications which have become quite notorious over the years. A series of publications called the Dossier Secret, Secret Dossier. And there's about 7 or 8 of these deposits that were made in the library by this group who are known today as the Priory of Sion. I personally think of them as a small group of literary esoteric pranksters in the second half of the 1960s in Paris. And they deposited a series of texts, and out of these texts has grown the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery as we kind of know it today from the late 60s. But one of the texts is quite different, and it's this one, Le Serpent Rouge. It's quite different from the rest. First of all, it's named, there are 3 authors named on the document as the authors, but certainly these authors, these named people were not the authors of the document. In fact, they had nothing at all to do with it, and we'll talk about that in a little moment. There's also some very strange circumstances around their deaths. So there's already some mystery about the appearance of the poem, but let's get to that. First of all, I have a facsimile of it here, and I'll show you some pages from it, but it's about 16 pages long. Most of apart from the poem in the front, is made up of sort of odd pictures, genealogies, clippings, maps. But the important part of the document is this poem of 3 pages. So here's the first page. It's called Le Serpent Rouge, Notes on Saint-Germain-des-Prés and Saint-Sulpice de Paris, which is one of the biggest churches in Paris. There's a weird coat of arms here. There's the 3 authors are given here. The names are Pierre Fugère, Louis Saint-Maxent, and Gaston de Coquet. There's a seal here. There's their names and addresses here. The second page has a quotation here from a book called Alchemy Moderne, and an interesting little line drawing here, which is made by the French esotericist Oswald Wirth. And we'll talk a little bit more about him later. And it's published 17th of January 1967. So then after those introductory pages, here is the poem itself. It's spread over 3 pages. It's not really a poem, it's a prose poem. It consists of 13 stanzas. There's one more page to come, and each stanza has a little symbol before it, which is a glyph of one of the signs of the zodiac. There's actually 13 stanzas, there's 13 signs. This zodiac includes the sign of a Ophiuchus, which is a little strange to English-speaking ears, but in European astrology, it's much more common, and quite often Ophiuchus is included as one of the signs. We're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. And here's the final page, and it's signed at the bottom, October 1966, the author, Louis Saint-Maxent. Now, the first mystery about this poem is the events surrounding the deposition of it. This is the actual deposition slip that was deposed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Now, on the face of it, it was registered. It was registered for deposition on the 15th of February 1967. So the book was presented to the library, and they took it in and they made up this form, and they typed it out. Then it was there for 6 weeks, and then on the 20th of March up here, it was approved, and then it went into the library. So there was this 6-week period from being lodged to being approved. The weird thing is that halfway through that period, these 3 gentlemen all committed suicide on the same weekend by hanging. The weekend of March 6th, 7th, 1967, these 3 gentlemen committed suicide. So on the face of it, this looks like a very shocking and macabre situation. That these 3 men published a poem, and then they were immediately killed before it came out, and then it came out. That's what it looks like. In fact, that's not what happened. And we can be absolutely certain what happened because an enterprising French journalist and writer called Frank Marie investigated this situation, and he discovered something very interesting. He went back and examined the typewriter that had typed out the poem of Le Serpent Rouge. Now it turns out that every typewriter in the old days of manual typewriters has slightly different spacings, if there's a flaw in a character, so almost like forensically you can identify if a document was typed by the same typewriter. He was able to determine that definitely this document was typed up on the same typewriter that had been used to type out the poem of Le Serpent Rouge. So, he was able to work out what happened. If not why, he was able to work out what happened. And this is what happened. The person who was going to be putting Le Serpent Rouge out into the world had typed it out on his typewriter. And this was March 1967. Then these 3 people, and incidentally, the journalist went and actually interviewed the families, interviewed the people, and all the families assured him these people had no interest in the esoteric, had never written anything in their life, didn't know each other. There was no doubt about it. They had no involvement at all. So the weekend happened, this macabre coincidence, the 3 deaths. After this mysterious person, whoever's doing this, finds out about this and decides for some reason to credit this to these 3 deceased people. So he's got a contact within the library. He gets a blank deposit sheet from his contact. He types it up on the same typewriter that he made Le Serpent Rouge. And then with the aid of his contact on the inside, he backdates it and gets it put into the system. So now it's actually in the system, but then created out of the system. After March 6th, but looking like it was before March 6th. Then it gets stamped and entered in, and away this weird situation has been created. So already there's something very odd going on here with this poem. So let's now move on to looking at the poem itself. So, as I said, it consists of 13 stanzas. Now, it's a kind of almost a stream of consciousness, one would might say a surrealist poem in the imagery. And on reading it, it's kind of a bewildering series of imageries, but it is possible to pick out a narrative through it. And the narrative is of a walk through a forest. So, we can read up some bits later, but the narrator, who is unnamed, has a sword and he's going to cut his way through the vegetation of the forest, and he's on his way to a place which is called the Source de la Madeleine. The Source de la Madeleine. Now, it's clear then that this landscape is somewhere around Rennes-les-Bains. There's several places that it's possible to work out what is meant in the poem. And there's also several quotations from a famous book, which we'll talk about later, Vraie, Langue, Celtique, by the priest Boudet, which turn up in this poem. So there's no doubt that the poem is set somehow around Rennes-les-Bains, and somehow it's based around a walk somewhere around Rennes-les-Bains. But it's full of esoteric references to Saint Sulpice, to art, to Meridians. There's all sort of references to Isis, to alchemy, to fairy tales, and more. And then at the end of the poem, it turns out it was all a dream, as these things do end. All right, so what are the questions that face us when we look at this poem? Well, the thing about it is it comes out of the Rennes-le-Château mystery, but as I said, it's really completely different from everything else. It's got a very different tone. It's clearly not written by any of the people who are responsible for the other materials. It's got a very different agenda. It doesn't even mention Zodiac. It's got nothing to do with treasure. So it's clear that there's something different about this. So who really did write it? And what is it all about? What is the nature of the Zodiac in particular? Why is there a Zodiac that seems to be calibrating the progress of this walk somehow around the landscape of Nerval? And then finally, there's a couple of identities in the poem, which is clear that the poet is inviting us to figure out who they are. And the 2 key ones are, first of all, this person called Cet Ami, this friend. There's several references to him in the first 2 or 3 stanzas, which are very specific and include a very interesting riddle. And it's obvious, as I say, the author is daring us to try and figure out who this person is. And finally, there's the Serpent Rouge itself. In the last part of the poem, in the Sagittarius segment, our narrator, after going on his heroic journey through the woods, comes face to face with this giant red serpent and has this encounter. What is this? What is the serpent? Now, obviously, a red serpent is a concept that readily lends itself to symbolism, all kinds of symbols. Snakes are the most symbolic thing of all. But the poem is a little bit more specific. It actually says, when it gets to this point, I turned to the east, and in front of me I saw the giant red serpent with its feet in the water, and it was going up the flank of the White Mountain. If you take the poem at face value, there's something that he sees when he gets to this point in the poem. Well, it's really nearly 60 years since the poem came out, and literally there's been no progress at all on these questions. It remains as much of a mystery as it did when it came out, although there's been thousands of pages and words devoted to it, and once dug into all the individual references and come up, there's no one's coming anywhere near it. So I began my journey in the Rennes Chateau material back in the mid-90s, inspired by Henri Lincoln's book, The Holy Place. I was particularly interested, in fact, I was only interested in the landscape geometry. In fact, I sort of decided at the time, you know what, I'm not going to pay any attention to the rest of this, the parchments, I'm not interested, I'm interested in the landscape geometry. But there was one thing that did pique my interest, and that was the Serpent Rouge. Precisely because it made no sense in the rest of the material. Now, never even crossed my mind that I would have anything to contribute to this, that I would have anything to do with solving any of these mysteries. But something very strange happened. I happened to be reading 1 or 2 books that had absolutely nothing to do with the Rennes Chateau mysteries. This is back in the 90s. I was reading all kinds of things, haunting secondhand bookshops. And these 2 books turned out to be extremely relevant to the Serpent Rouge. From there, I had kind of a pathway, and I kept on following that. And since then, there were, as I've come to put this talk together, I realised there were 6 clues, and then a seventh, which led me to crack this poem wide open. So tonight, I'd like to take you through these 6 clues, and then the 7th, and then, armed with some deep knowledge about where this poem came from, we're going to be able to use that knowledge to really get to grips with what the poem's about for the first time. So, clue number 1, Carl Jung and alchemy. So this is the book. Right. This is the book I was reading way back in the 90s. Carl Jung's Psychology and Alchemy. Psychology and Alchemy. I don't know if any of you have this book or read this book. It's a fantastic book. It's full of pictures. For example, there's hundreds of images in it. Amazing collection of esoteric images from all over. It's worth it for the price of the images alone. So I bought it and I put it on my shelf with all my other stuff, and then slowly I began dipping into it and slowly coming to terms with what Jung is saying in here. So here's the original copy. This is Psychology and Alchemy. There's a second book. This is his final book that he ever wrote. It's called Mysterium Coniunctionis. It's kind of crowning achievement of his life work. And in many ways, it's the continuation of the themes that he picks up in Psychology and Alchemy. So let's remind ourselves, Professor Carl Jung, of course, we all know Jung, his dates are 1875 to 1961, Swiss psychologist, psychiatrist, wrote many, many incredible books, incredible insights. All right, so now this is the sort of difficult bit for me, because now I have to sort of describe to you what the sort of central ideas of this book are. Now, I don't imagine any one of you imagine that 15 minutes into this we'll be talking about Carl Jung's understanding of the subconscious of alchemy. But here we are, and this is where we have to start tonight's story. So I have to attempt sort of boil down the central idea of this book. Now, it's a really difficult book, it's complicated, it's erudite, it's full of really deep quotes from passages. But when you dig through all that, there's actually one very simple idea at the heart of the book. So if you'll indulge me now, just for a moment or two, I need to step through 2 or 3 ideas to get to this point, which is then going to be the key motif that takes us through the rest of the evening. So Jung is very interested in the mandala. Now, of course, we know what the mandala is. It comes from Eastern mysticism. The mandala is the circle with the center. And it's all about the center, a mandala. Now, mandalas can take on an infinite variety of forms. They can be elucidated any way you like, but essentially they come back to the center and the idea of the circle or circling around the center. Now, Jung starts the book off, in fact, the first third of the book is a series of dreams by patients, hundreds of them. And by analysing these dreams from patients from different ages, different languages, different cultures, different backgrounds, he discovers that there's this universal motif that runs through everybody's dreams, the motif of the mandala, that it comes up over and over again in dream analysis. So for Jung, this is a universal symbol, and it's a symbol of the self. It's wholeness. All right, so, I mean, I'm not even sure if this is even a dream, but for example, someone will dream of being in a garden, a walled garden, and they're doing a tour of the garden, and in the middle of the garden is a fountain. And okay, there it is. Jung will say, right, the fountain is the mandala. The walking around the fountain is the journey towards wholeness. So that this is happening on the inside, the dreamer is projecting it out into the world, projecting this inner movement, inner landscape onto the world at large, okay? Now then he elaborates this, he looks at the structure of the mandala, and he says that often the mandala has a 4-fold structure, like north, south, east, west, like a pair of crossed axes. So quite often it'll be a square or a castle or a pair of crossed things. And he also says that this is the nature of the first man, Adam. I'm not going to go into details of that, but the first man, Adam, within him, according to Jung, has this 4-fold structure, as does the mandala. So the self, wholeness, the first, you see how these ideas are sort of coalescing. Right, so the quest for wholeness is often figured in these dreams as a journey around a center, but the real breakthrough of the book is Jung discovering that the alchemists quite often depicted and wrote about what they were doing as precisely this, as a journey around a symbolic landscape. And he shows many examples of this, and he says the same thing is happening in alchemy as it is in dreams. Alchemy is not really about turning base metals into gold. That's just the physical side. It's really about the alchemist on his journey to the wholeness of the soul. All right? So this, in the simplest possible way, is what these 650 pages are illustrating. And there's one final thing about this, that quite often this journey around the landscape culminates in the final quadrant with an encounter with the great monster, with our fears, with our worst subconscious fears. So we encounter the dragon or the big serpent. And again, he shows all these alchemical texts, and this is exactly what happens. So he's on his initiatory pilgrimage, and he's got a quest, and he goes around the world, and then he has to confront his worst fears, and then he finds wholeness of the soul. Okay? Now, as I say, you can find this literally on every page, but there's one section of 20, 30 pages where these ideas really come to a crescendo. And this is probably the place where that idea is expressed the most succinctly by Jung. So if you don't mind, I'll just read from here. Here's the anthropos, the first man, symbolized by the 4 elements, or the lapis, which is the philosopher's stone of the alchemists, which has the same structure. He's also symbolized by the cross, whose ends correspond to the 4 cardinal points. This motif is often replaced by corresponding journeys, such as those of Osiris, the labours of Heracles, the troubles of Enoch, and the symbolic peregrinatio to the 4 quarters in Michael Meyer. Now, Michael Meyer is one of these alchemists. And in the footnotes, the journeys lead to the 4 quarters of the earth, or the journey begins in Europe, leads to America, to Asia, to Africa. So you see Jung then stating this idea. All right, this is page 369, by the way. It's falling out here because it's so well thumbed. All right. And I'm just looking up the other night, looking up Jung's dates, actually, I stumbled upon this image. This is from Jung's Red Book, which is published after his death, which is his private dream journal. Well, this image is just a perfect illustration of exactly what he's talking about. Here's the dreamer, here's the mandala. It's a fourfold. You see that? And it's a circle. So it's a 4-fold circular mandala, and here it is in the landscape. So I just looked at that image and I thought, okay, that's the idea from Jung, exactly encapsulated in one image. All right, so I'm reading this, And I'm also doing this Rennes-le-Chateau, and I'm reading Le Serpent Rouge, and slowly this idea started to occur to me. I started to realise, you know what? The Serpent Rouge is exactly the type of story that Jung is talking about here. It's this ritual pilgrimage. It's around a landscape, and it's going around because of the Zodiac, right? So it's doing a full circle around a centre. And in the final quadrant of the poem, our guy meets the giant red serpent, and this is very uncanny. Now, it's difficult to convey this, in short, without reading the book literally, but I got to the point where, to me, the idea that this author of Le Serpent Rouge had no idea about Jung and had written the poem was incomprehensible. It was clear to me that whoever wrote Le Serpent Rouge must have read this book, and then sat down to literally write a poem along the very template and lines that Jung is talking about here. So I became convinced that that was the case. And there's actually still, this was in the 90s, and there's actually still a short piece of mine on the internet. You can still find it if you type Silent Miles and Serpent Rouge. You see in the 90s that I was saying this, I think Carl Jung, someone had read Carl Jung, but that was as far as it went. And really, it doesn't really narrow it down much, does it? Because plenty of people have read Jung, and so I didn't really think that it would make any difference in the big picture. But it was an interesting feeling to have felt that I'd found a part of the trail that the author of this poem had followed. All right. Now, it wasn't so much a question of sort of any exact, I couldn't find any quotes in Jung which exactly turn up in Serpent Rouge, but this one is pretty close. This is the stanza Sagittarius where he meets the Serpent Rouge. Here it is. And I'm just going to highlight the words. He talks about having received the mark of baptism, and the Serpent Rouge is here, and then salty and bitter, these words here. Well, in Jung's follow-up book, Mysterium Conjunctiotis, that's the correct pronunciation, this whole section is in this section called Salt, number 5. And this is the beginning, the first sentence of this pick. In this section, I shall discuss not only salt, but a number of symbolisms that are closely connected with it, such as the bitterness of the sea, its baptismal quality, and in turn relates it to the Red Sea. So, okay, we have baptism, salty and bitter, and redness, all in the same paragraph. Now, I wouldn't construct an argument on that, but having already convinced myself that the author had read this book, this did seem to me to be going pretty close to a fingerprint that the author was leaving. The second book I was reading was this fantastic book. And again, some of you may have seen it. It's called Sacred Geography of the Ancient Greeks by Jean Richet. Astrological Symbolism in Art, Architecture and Landscape. This is translated by Christine Rohn, who some of you might know. I think it came out in 1997 or 1994. I didn't get my copy to the early 2000s, and I was transfixed by this book. And it describes the discovery by this person, Jean Richet, we're about to meet, of what he calls landscape zodiacs. In the ancient world, around centres like, for example, Delphi, he discovered the landscape divided up into 12 segments and then allocated to signs of the zodiac. Not only at Delphi, he discovered at all these other locations around the Mediterranean, and it's described in this book. Now, I'm going to talk more about this book, but he's a very interesting guy, Jean Richet. First of all, he's a professor, here's his dates, 1915 to 1992. He's a professor of French literature. His speciality was symbolist poetry, and in particular, the works of a particular French poet, Gérard de Nerval. We're going to meet him later. He's a kind of a mid-tier. He's not very famous, almost unknown outside the French world, but very, very highly regarded French poet and short story writer of the early first half of the 19th century in Paris. And Professor Jean Richet literally devoted his career to the work of Gérard de Nerval. He was the editor of his collected works, and then he had a second career that started. We're going to talk about that in a moment, which led to this book that came out in 1967, by the way, the original French book of this. All right, so here we go. Jean Richet, it's 1957. He's with his wife in Delphi, not in Delphi, in Athens, in Greece. And he loves touring around the ancient sites with his wife. So he's now had this career for 40 years as a professor of symbolist poetry, expert on Nerval. He's gone to visit Delphi, and when they're at Delphi, he's noticed that there's a temple to Athena Pranaya, the goddess, at the entrance to the temple of Delphi. And he says, well, isn't it funny? Because Delphi is dedicated to Apollo. Why when you arrive, is there a temple to Athena there? You think, well, this is a bit of an odd question. So he started reading, and there was no reference anywhere that he could find to answer this question. So he had the question in his mind, why is this temple to Athena there? So they were in Athens one night, and he had a dream. And in his dream, a Kouros statue appeared. Now, this is one of the Kouros statues. It's in the Athens Museum, and he actually says it's one like this. These are very interesting, mysterious statues that were dug up 600, 800 BC. I'm not going to go down, but have a look at it. There's a very interesting topic, the Kouros statue. So in his dream, he's standing in front of a Kouros statue, and the Kouros statue turned on its axis. It turned 180 degrees, so it was now facing away from him. He wakes up, and he realizes instantly that it's an answer to the question that he's asked, and he does a very funny thing. This is 3 o'clock in the morning. He fumbles for the light switch, he gets a map of Greece, and he goes, right, there's Delphi, there's Athens, and he gets a ruler and he draws a line. And he said, this is what the statue was telling him. By turning around, the statue was telling him, draw a line from Delphi through Athens. So he draws the line from Delphi through Athens and keeps on going, and is astonished to discover that it passes through the island of Delos, the tiny island where Apollo was born. So we have the Apollo statue telling him to draw a line from the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi through Athens, and the line carries on through his birthplace, and then he carried on to the island of Rhodes to another sanctuary of Apollo at a place called Camaros. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, he's drawn this line, it's gone through Delphi, Athens, Delos, and Camaros. There's the line. 500 miles long through these 4 sites associated with Apollo. Now, it still didn't answer the question immediately of why then is there a temple to Athena, but it started him on a process. It started him looking into this. And keep in mind that this material came in a dream of a statue. Eventually he discovered that that line was one of only 6 lines centered on Delphi, and here's the one that he originally dreamed, making up a 12-fold division of the landscape around Delphi. And then he discovered, when he looked at the towns, he allocated the zodiac signs in that particular way, you can see, and he did that in a sensible way by noticing that, for example, well, let's take one example. There's an island here called Hydra. Well, Hydra is a constellation that is in the constellation of Leo in the sky. So there's places on the map which are named after star locations which are in that zodiac place. There are other cities that have coins that have on the coin the zodiac symbol of that segment. And this is what much of the book is made up in. The book is very scholarly. He's a professor. This is 1967. He goes to a lot of trouble to establish that these relationships between the landscape and the zodiac are real. It's very astonishing stuff. Now, the thing is that it's actually completely consonant with what the Greeks themselves said. This is Plato in the Laws. The founder must see that his city is placed as nearly as possible in the centre of the territory. Then he must divide his city into 12 parts. Next, he'll be at pains to assign the 12 divisions to 12 gods, naming each section after the god to whom it's been allotted and consecrated and calling it a tribe. In other words, Plato was telling you, this is the way to set up cities. We do them as reflections of the heavens above. We lay them out on a zodiac. Jean Rocher, it was as if the whole territory of historical Greece, having been considered as a vast zodiacal clock, with its centre at Delphi, a distribution of functions between the cities had been carried out. Now he then extended his discoveries to the rest of the Mediterranean. It's not going to go everywhere, but here's one of his other follow-up books, Geographic sacrée dans le monde romain, where he develops these to the whole Mediterranean basin and goes around. So here's a map showing all these alignments, and they're all zodiac alignments, as you can see. Over here's the Grand Meridian of Gaul, as he calls it, which corresponds to the meridian that we have today, the Paris-Zero meridian. This is it. Richer says it's an ancient meridian. And so there's a whole system that emerged from Richer's work. He then spent the next 30 years of his life, wrote a series of books on this, and so ended up with 2 careers, 3 or 4 books on the work of Nerval, 3 or 4 works on these landscape zodiacs. The Greeks, the Etruscans, the Carthaginians had patiently woven a fabric of correspondence between the sky, especially the apparent course of the sun through the zodiac, the inhabited earth, and the cities built by humanity. And the reason? To create unity and solidity in a cosmos that was conceived as the harmonious equilibrium of the three planes of the underworld, the earth, and the celestial spheres. All right, so this is John Richet's writings. This is the only book of his that's been translated into English. The others remain in French. So again, just like with Jung, I was reading this book and I was thinking, well, this is rather fascinating. Richet's book came out in 1967. Well, that's the same year as the Rennes-les-Bains, the whole thing. That's the same year as the Serpent Rouge. And here he is, basically introducing into the modern world the idea of landscape zodiacs. And here over in this poem of the Serpent Rouge, we seem to have some kind of landscape zodiac. Gosh, it's all in Paris. All these books are in Paris. The Serpent Rouge is published in Paris. L'Aude du Rennes by Gérard just said, the Rennes-les-Bains book, that's in Paris. Richet's book is Paris in Paris. Surely these guys knew each other. They must have. How could Richet not have had something to do with the Serpent Rouge? This is what's going on here. Paris, it's a city, but it's also a village. Come on. The number of people who are into symbolist poetry, and you could fit in a taxi in Paris then or now. So I read Richet, and this is in the early 2000s, and I'd read Jung, and I thought, did Richet have something to do with this? So I thought, well, I haven't seen his name associated with it. No one else has brought his name up in this. All right, I'm going to quietly set out to see what I can find. Okay, here we go. So we've got two clues. We've got Carl Jung and alchemy, and we've got Jean Richet and landscape zodiacs. All right, let's keep going. The third clue is zodiac in the landscape. So I started, I'm from Australia, as you can tell. This was all in Australia in the 90s. Finally, in 2006, I got the chance to come here for the first time, and it changed my life and blew my mind. And then for the next few years, I was coming back. Now, back and forth between Australia and here. Now, on one of those trips, I bought this really fantastic book. Here it is, Histoire de Rennes-les-Bains. Some of you might know this book. I think it came out in 2006. It's an excellent book full of local history and local knowledge about Rennes-les-Bains. It covers all kinds of very interesting topics. But what interested me more than anything was, he talks about the fact that Rennes-les-Bains, and for those who don't know, Rennes-les-Bains is a little village, a couple of kilometres just over there. Here it is on Google Earth, in here. It dates back to the Roman times. It's a pre-Roman village. And these authors explain that it was laid out, just like all Roman villages and towns were, along cardo decumanus axes. These are the right-angled axes that the Romans would use as the basis of their town planning. Now, normally the cardo, the meridian, is a north-south line, but the system has got flexibility built in. So it really depends on the local topography, the local landscape. In the case of Rennes-les-Bains, as you all know, it's in a very narrow valley, hemmed in, and it runs along the river, the river bank, and so the axis is clearly along that way, and this is exactly what the Roman axis was, as these guys, Riviera and Boudet, document. So what I've done with this is I've copied straight across information from that map. So the true, ancient, correct historical cardo of Rennes-les-Bains is this. It runs at, if you measure it, it's about 15 degrees from north. And it happens to terminate on the mountain Cardo up here to the north of Rennes-les-Bains, which is rather fascinating because this is a cardo, that is a Roman meridian, and it's aimed directly at a mountain called Cardo, Cardo. It's clear that the mountain is named after the cardo itself. Now, what these guys don't observe is if you continue this line further down, it actually goes exactly to the Templar Chateau at Bézout, which is, you'll see on another map later. So Bézout, Rennes-les-Bains, Cardo. This way, the decumanus, this axis goes to Rennes-le-Chateau. And that's why to this day, in the central square of Rennes-les-Bains, there's a sign saying Place des Deux Rennes, and it refers to Rennes-les-Bains and Rennes-le-Chateau, and they've been anciently connected on the decumanus for thousands of years. All right, so I wanted to start tonight's landscape geometry with this, because this is solid historical basis based on local historians. No woo, if I can use that word. This is pure history. We're on solid ground here. There's a pair of crossed axes which cross in the square by the church in the centre of Rennes-les-Bains. All right. Now, I want to talk about landscape geometry that Henri brought up. So now, in the 1990s, I read Henri's book, The Holy Place. I was inspired to check his work, and it set me on a path which has led me all these years later to here tonight. Now, I'm only going to talk about one line that Henri talks about in his book tonight, just one line, and this is it. It goes from the church at Saint Just at Avezu. It goes through the ancient Templar commandery at a place called La Valdieu. It goes through the church at Rennes-les-Bains, goes up the hill through the ruined chateau of Montferrand, then over the hill to Chateau Arc up here. 5 sites, 7 miles, perfect alignment. You can roll it on your map and it goes through all 5, no fudging. Now, Henri didn't actually discover this line. He talks about it, but it was discovered by a guy called David Wood, who wrote books called Genesis and Geneset, which some of you may remember. Well, I found this line very interesting and very impressive, and on its own, 5 sites, 7 miles, exact alignment, it's pretty convincing, but there's something else about this line that neither Henri or David Wood ever remarked on. And that is that the line is pointed at an angle of exactly 45 degrees north. It runs 45 degrees. It runs northeast, southwest. Now, that seems to be pretty impressive. To find 5 sites in a line is one thing, but for that line to be orientated at a nice compass angle, okay, if we're looking for a candidate for intentionality, this has all the hallmarks of a possibility there. Now, this is Arc Chateau. I'm sure many of you have visited this wonderful, splendid structure, which is at the northeast corner of it. This is the plan of Arc Chateau, and amazingly enough, the cross-section of the chateau is actually a square like this, and the 45 actually runs along the diagonal of the tower. Moreover, there's a guardhouse in the corner, and the relationship between the tower and the guardhouse is such that the 45 also runs, so right through the corner of this wall, through the guardhouse, and through the Arc Chateau itself. So if they're trying to convince us that this is a genuine alignment, well, they keep on adding clues to the pile. Okay, well, so I went back to Australia with this book, and I still remember the day. There's been several moments in this where there's been breakthroughs, and tonight I'm going to share 3 or 4 with you. And there are moments that punctuated this journey where something changed, and this is one of them. I had a fresh, brand new map of the area. I ruled in the Cardo Decumanus axis like that, and then I ruled in my 45-degree line. I don't even know what I thought I was doing, but I just ruled those 3 lines in, and then I sat back and looked at it. And as I looked at it, it suddenly occurred to me, well, goodness, if that's at 15 degrees and that's at 45 degrees, well, that must be 30 degrees between those 2 lines. Well, here I've been obsessed with Jean Brochet and landscape zodiacs. All I'm thinking about is 12 segments of 30 degrees surrounding all these places. I suddenly realised, well, have I stumbled upon a 12-fold division of landscape around Rennes-les-Bains? There's 2 good lines and they're giving me one 30-degree segment. Well, what happens if I now rule in the other lines? Let's see what happens. Well, this is what happens. Now, immediately the most impressive is that the next one that you draw around this side passes through the Templar Chateau of Chateau Blanchefort, a spectacular local spot, and Roc Negre, the Black Rock, which is in a spectacular location there. So this line passes between these 2 sites and the church. And when I finish with the lines, well, they actually end up in quite a few places. This is Grannès. There's a couple of mountain tops that they hit over here. And I've also drawn in the Meridian, the north-south line, through, again, the Church of Rennes-les-Bains. It passes through a couple of locations. It passes through the Source de la Madeleine, the spring south of the city. It passes through the Chateau at La Violette, which is a city at the bottom of chasm here. And it passes through the church at St. Louis down further. So here's 7 alignments converging on the Rennes-les-Bains church, or the square, seemingly dividing the landscape into a 12-fold division, just like Richer had found. Well, at this point, I was starting to feel like I might be onto something. So we've got 3 clues now. We've got Jung and alchemy, we've got Richer and the landscape zodiacs, and now I've discovered a 12-fold division of landscape centered on Rennes-les-Bains. All right, so the 4th clue now is Henri Boudet's Vraie, Langue, Celtique. I'm sure there's a book, Celtique. It's a book I'm sure many of you have heard of. So this is a very odd book, published apparently in 1886 by the priest of Rennes-les-Bains, and it's puzzled researchers ever since. I've got a copy of the book here. Vraie, Langue, Celtique, and the cromlech of Rennes-les-Bains. All right, so very quickly. The book consists of a long text, which is mad, in which Boudet describes what he calls a cromlech, or a stone circle. Supposedly, it's this huge thing around Rennes-les-Bains, and he describes it, but here's the thing, there's nothing there, as he described it. It doesn't exist. There's no controversy over that. What he says there is not there. All right, so whatever he's talking about, he doesn't mean what he says. There's a mystery. No one's ever been able to figure out. The rest of the book is a bizarre theory that the languages, all the languages of the world, all go back to English. English. The Celtic language comes from English. Nutty. Very nutty stuff. We're not going to delve too much into that. We're going to talk a little bit about the cromlech and try to understand what he might have meant by it. But what I do want to talk about is this map that's in the back of the book. It includes this map. Now, there's a couple of different versions of this map because there's a couple of different versions of his book. Okay, the book comes out in 1886. In 1978, there are two editions, facsimile editions of this book that are released with two different introductions. One by Pierre Plantard, a name I'm sure many of you know, we'll come back to him. The other by Gérard de Sède, another name I'm sure you know. Two separate editions of this book. Identical facsimiles of the text, two different introductions. Both of them include a map. All right, so here's the book. Here's the front of it. And I've shown here the two different maps. On the left is the map that's included in this one, which is the one that has the introduction by Pierre Plantard. On the right is the map that is included in the de Sède edition. Now, the de Sède edition has also been reprinted now, again, in another facsimile edition by Bellassin. And in fact, there's been an English translation of it. And so the book that you buy, if any of you have ever bought a copy of Boudet's book, Vraie, Langue, Celtique, you've bought a copy of this one, the one that is the de Sède introduction. The 1978 one with Plantard, this one is an extremely rare book. I have never seen a copy ever except this one, which I came across one day in the bookshop up at Rennes Chateau at an unbelievable price, and I did not hesitate to pay the price. Because I've been wanting to get my hands on this book for many, many, many years. I think the introduction is on the internet in French, but it's not anywhere even translated into English. But nobody's got this book, nobody's seen this book. All right, and this is the 1978 Plantard edition. All right, so let's talk about Boudet's cromlech. What is it? All right, we don't know what it is, but in chapter 7, he gives us a tour of his cromlech. In chapter 7, he goes on a walk and he tells you on the walk. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start by plotting his walk. All right, so I've got his map. What I've done is I've superimposed it on Google Earth at the correct scale and location. Then I've gone through chapter 7 and I've written down all the place names and then I've found them on his map. And I've traced out the route that he's taken. He starts here on Pescardo, he comes down the flank, he crosses the river, he heads up here to Chateau Blanche Fort, going past Roc Negre, and then retraces his steps. Then he heads up to the west side, climbs the hill, and walks along this cliff here, past these rare spots, down here, past the source of the Madeleine, back, up and around, and back to Cardo. He does this big loop. Now, it's actually easy to work out, even though he doesn't tell you the path, it's easy to work out what the path that he went on, because the path is exactly the same today. These paths never change. They've been the same paths for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. So you can see on the map exactly the path. You can walk it today, exactly this path. It hasn't changed. So, all right. So, now, remember our clues. Remember we're trying to solve the Serpent Rouge. One day the idea occurred to me, okay, nobody knows what this walk around Rennes-les-Bains is. What if the walk in the Serpent Rouge is Boudet's walk in chapter 7? What if the person is shadowing Boudet's walk in chapter 7? Okay, well, let's test that out, shall we? So now I've drawn the path of the walk in the Serpent Rouge. Now, as I said, there's only a couple of places you can identify, but you can identify Chateau Blanche Fort and Roc Negre, so we're going to start up there in the third stanza. Now, it says in the poem that their goal is to reach the source de la Madeleine. That's down here. And again, there's only one way to get there. You walk up here, you walk down exactly the way Boudet did, and now you stop at the source de la Madeleine. It's a very lovely spot. A little picnic, have a little rest. Then you keep going. Now, the other place that's identified is Pescardo, and it's clear that the poem ends on Pescardo. It's a little bit difficult It's called the White Mountain. I'm not going to go into detail unless someone wants to ask later as to why Peshkado is the White Mountain, but there's some very good reasons. So, we start here, Chateau Blanchefort, we come down to the source of Madeleine and back up. Look, it's the same as Boudet's. It's the same journey. Well, that's interesting. So then everything started to fuse. So then it's like, okay, what if Le Serpent Rouge is Boudet's walk in chapter 7 around the Zodiac of Rennes-les-Bains that I have found? All right, is that possible that when we allocate the zodiac signs in some sensible way, that then as we pass the walk, that the things will end up in the right places? If they do, then everything, ding, 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 we get lights up and we're right. All of these different schemes are correct. So, we know from the poem that the source de la Madeleine is in Leo. All right, so there's the straight off test right away. Now, how are we going to allocate the zodiac signs? All right, and it turns out that actually we haven't got any choice. There's only one way to do it. If you're thinking about the poem starts, actually I didn't point this out at the beginning, but it starts with Aquarius. It doesn't start with Aries, it starts with Aquarius, which is a bit of an odd thing. All right, so it has to start with Aquarius. But where does it start? Well, Boudet is very clear in this book. He says that the opening to the cromlech, the start of the cromlech, is here to the north of Rennes-les-Bains. And that makes perfect sense. That's the way you get there today. If you're going home tonight, you're going to drive along from Couiza along here, and then you're going to turn right and drive here. This indeed is the entrance to this day into Rennes-les-Bains. So Boudet says the opening of the cromlech is there, and Le Serpent Rouge says that the first stanza is Aquarius. Then we don't have any choices. Aquarius has to be allocated here, and then all these zodiacs in Riche, they all go anti-clockwise. So when we're then going to allocate the signs, and that's it. We can't change anything. We're locked in. Now we can see how we're going. So let's do it. Ding, here we are. Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, around we go. First of all, let's check. Leo, source de la Madeleine is in Leo. We're looking good. Let's go back to here. Chateau Blanchefort and Roc Negre. If we look at the Pisces verse, it says, sitting on the column on a white rock, looking towards the south over the black rock. This is the reference to Chateau Blanchefort and Roc Negre. So we're saying you stand at Chateau Blanchefort, you're looking over Roc Negre towards the south, and this is Pisces. And look, this line is the start of the Pisces segment. It's the very line, Chateau Blanchefort over Roc Negre towards the south to the church in the centre. So we've now got two direct hits. Cardo is in the right spot in Capricorn when we're trying to get to the mountain. So we're looking good. So at this point I'm going to assert that this is the solution to the Le Serpent Rouge. I've got a lot of material to cover still. But this, I assert, is the correct solution that the author of the poem Le Serpent Rouge used. This is the path that they walked, this is the zodiac, and this is why the stanzas are where they are. All right, there's another view of it. So now, if this is all true, then this means we should be able to solve the Le Serpent Rouge puzzle now. We should be able to figure out what the Serpent Rouge is. Because remember, in the poem, when we get to Sagittarius, I turn again to the east, and in front of me I see, unrolling without end, the coils of the enormous red serpent. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to zoom in on my solution, and here's the Sagittarius section. And let's look here at the path. The path comes up through the Ophiuchus section here. I didn't talk about that. I'll talk about that. Someone should have said. But how do you fit Ophiuchus in the 13 signs into the 12-fold division of landscape? Excellent question. We'll come back to that. But for the moment, here comes the path up through Ophiuchus, up over the brow of a hill, and then it hits the road and it turns immediately to the right. See that? Towards the east. So this is the spot in the poem. I've marked X. This is the spot where we've reached the Sagittarius segment. We've turned east. Now, in front of us, facing you, should be a giant red serpent. Okay, let's have a look. Well, let's look over here. Whoa, wait a second. What's this? What's this thing here? All right, let's have a better look at it. All right, here's an aerial view now from the other side. Our point X is down here. We're looking across here. But look at this. This is a forestry trail that is going up the flank of Peshkado. This is a pine plantation here. And this is a forestry trail that has been cut into the mountain. Now, I was hovering around on Google Earth, this is back in 2007, I saw this and I gasped. I thought, look, that's the red serpent. Now, this was in 2008. I was in Australia, had to email Judith and ask her to go to point X, point the camera towards the north, and take a photo. And this is the photo she took. Here we have Peshkar Dome, and here you can see the pine plantation. Now you can see it's different. It's hard to see from here now in 2008, but you can just make out this path snaking down the mountain. Now we'll just zoom in a bit more. And there it is coming down there. Now the path certainly exists today, you can walk up it, but here's the thing. In 1967, this had just been planted. There's online aerial photos from the late 1950s showing that this was still natural forest then. So in the first half of the 1960s, they cut this down, they put this pine forest in. Now imagine in 1966 when you're walking, the trees were tiny and the earth is red, and you see this red path quite clearly from here through the trees. Here's a photo I took, well I don't know how the colour looks, but that's just a photo of the path over there. It's literally called Le Sentier Rouge, the trail there, because the path is red, the earth is red. So here we have, in the place that the poem says, right in front of us, a giant red serpent-shaped scar in the mountain. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? All right, so here I've made this lovely video. This is a video on Google Earth that I've made, in which we're going to have a nice little swoop over and just see what a lovely bowl shape, what an integrated bowl it is. Pretty spectacular, the Pyrenees in the background. Here we come along, here's Peshkar Dome, there's the Cardo, there's the entrance, there's the Pisces line. Coming around to Rennes Chateau, and of course right now we're down here in Couiza, and there we go. That was the fourth clue. Boudet's love Vraie, Langue, Celtique. Okay, we're starting to assemble a picture, but we're not quite there yet. The fifth clue, Oswald Wirth and Le Serpent Rouge. One day in 2010, I went to the Esperanza markets, and there's a lovely chap there who sells second-hand books. And I went past, and this book literally fell off the table into my hand. It was ridiculous. Here it is. The Serpent Rouge by Goethe. Conte symbolique, a symbolic fairy tale, translated and with commentary by Oswald Wirth. And I must show you that when I open this book, it's actually got a 4-leaf clover in it, which is rather delightful. So this is a very special book. Now this is a very special book. This came out in 1922. This is a 1970s facsimile edition of it. So Oswald Wirth was a really interesting guy. He was an esotericist. He designed a tarot, a set of tarot cards, the famous Marseille Tarot. But this is a really influential text in French esoteric history. First of all, I have to talk about Goethe's story. Goethe wrote a story called, in English, it's called The Green Snake, and the Beautiful Lily. And Goethe had this idea. He wanted to write a fairy story that on the surface was a delightful fairy story, but underneath was a deep esoteric story that contained deep esoteric truths. And this was the outcome. So Oswald Wirth comes along and translates it into French and writes this very extraordinary essay about it. And his interpretation of Goethe's story is a classic. And he interprets it in terms of the symbolism of the tarot. So it's up the back here, for example, here's a page, there's the Fool tarot card, and here he's examining how the character of the giant in the story is represented by the tarot. So the book is very influential, the book is very well known, and look at the title, Le Serpent Vert, the green serpent. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? We've got a red serpent and a green serpent. So this was Oswald Wirth, died in 1943, designer of the Tarot de Marseille. And he was the person who did this little drawing that appears on this front cover of Le Serpent Rouge. This is his little drawing. Discover one by one the 64 stones. Okay, this is one of the tarot cards that he designed from the Marseille Tarot. This is the Wheel of Fortune. And look here, we've got a green serpent, Serpent Vert, and we've got a red serpent, Serpent Rouge. So it's clear that in some sense, Le Serpent Rouge is referencing this book by Oswald Wirth. It's clear because it's a very famous book in French esoteric circles, and it must have been that way. But what's really behind this is that carries across into the Serpent Rouge is not so much the fact that it's the red serpent and green serpent, it's the idea of the fairy tale concealing these deep esoteric truths. It's the idea of a story based on some kind of formal system. So in this case, it's the tarot. But more broadly, it could be other systems like the Zodiac, for example. So we have what seems to be a light, charming story on the surface, and underneath there's these deep esoteric archetypes going on. So that's what this book is about, and that's what the Goethe story is about. And clearly, you begin to see that this is something like this is what Le Serpent Rouge is attempting. Now, this is the card. So is there actually a connection between this and Rennes-les-Bains? Well, this is quite an amazing thing. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but here is the full card designed by Oswald Wirth from this famous Marceau tarot. Now, Pierre Plantard actually made a sequence of tarot cards based on Oswald Wirth's card. And here is Plantard's version of the full card, and he's got him located in the church of Rennes-les-Bains. If you look carefully, this is the graveyard of the church of Rennes-les-Bains. So you can look further into that. I'm not going to go any further down this, but this is the case that Plantard located the fool in the graveyard of Rennes-les-Bains. Now, it's easy to sort of start adding things up and spiraling off into the mysticism with Plantard, but what's happening here is that Plantard is making a reference in relation to this character, in relation to this book. In other words, Wirth identifies the fool as the giant in the story. Now, without going into what happens in the story, the ending of the story is amazing. There's an underground temple, and it comes to the surface, and the center of the town gets transformed into a sundial, which has magical signs all around, and the giant is frozen into the center of the sundial and becomes the center of this giant clock. Plantard has chosen to represent this character at the church of Rennes-les-Bains. Now, I'm not adding that to my pile of proofs, but it's a very interesting little side note. All right, so we're nearly done 5 clues, and now the 6th is Gérard de Nerval. Gérard de Nerval is the poet that Riche devoted his life to working with, and he's a really, really fascinating guy. His most famous saying is, "Le rêve est une seconde vie." Dream is a second life. Nerval lived his life on the intersection of the dream world and the waking world. He was a poet of the unconscious. In fact, he's considered the forerunner of the surrealists. He wrote travel writing. He was very, very broad in what he wrote. He wrote a series of short stories and one absolutely classic short novel called Sylvie. Umberto Eco called Sylvie one of the greatest books ever written. Nerval was fascinated by synchronicities and signs and symbolic connections between the world and his thoughts and his dreams. He was also obsessed with what the French call arithmosophy or gematria, the idea of turning names into numbers, filling pages of notebooks with complex calculations of numbers based on names and dates and symbolic connections. Now, Jean Riche spent his whole life studying the works of Nerval, and he is very explicit that this is what prepared him for the investigations into landscape geometry. He says, "The attentive and sustained study of the work of the poet Gérard de Nerval was a discipline that accustomed me to taking a comprehensive view of complex systems." All right, well, Riche wrote a number of books over the years, and his understanding of this short story of Nerval's Sylvie evolved. But in 1966, Riche published, and it's here somewhere, I'm going to look at this one, Nerval and the Kingdom of the Archetypes, several essays on the esoterics of Nerval's work. And this is from Riche's analysis of Nerval's short story Sylvie. And Riche shows that Nerval's story of 14 chapters unfolds around a zodiac, that each subsequent chapter is associated with the next sign of the zodiac, and the things that happen in that chapter are symbolic of that sign of the zodiac. So this is Riche 1966, interpreting Nerval's work, and it's another example of a conte initiatique. It's on the surface, this story, Sylvie, is a charming tale of life in the country of France, where the narrator goes back to visit the village of his childhood, and It's full of reminiscences and flash forwards and flashbacks. It's a brilliant piece of work. But Richer shows that this story is based on a zodiac. All right, well, at this point, you know, that's it. That's it. For me, obviously, Richer has written Le Serpent Rouge. Come on. It's a story that unfolds around a zodiac. He's discovered the landscape zodiacs. It's clear that it's based on Boudet's map. He's had various imports from various places, all on this idea of a story, a fairy story, which has underneath it this deep esoteric roots. So I was feeling that there was some kind of, what can I say, some kind of idea emerging of how it happened. Jean Richer, let's say in the mid-60s, somehow met up with these guys who were involved with the Rennes-les-Bains mystery. We'll talk about them in a moment. He was introduced to Boudet's book. He was taken down to Rennes-les-Bains. He discovered the Zodiac. They went for a walk around Boudet's chapter 7, and then he decided to write a poem. And he infused the poem with all these ideas that he was constantly obsessed with at the time, Nerval, the Zodiac, etc. So, all right, this is starting to build in my mind. But still, okay, that's great, but I haven't got a signed document. I haven't got a diary entry. I haven't got a video blog from Jean Richer saying, yes, it was me. I don't have, you know what I'm saying? I don't have what the world demands. Now, for me, having read all these books, I'm in a position where, for me, okay, I can see that there's really no alternative, but how do I convey this if you haven't read the books? So there has to be something more, doesn't there? There has to be, if not a signature, then at least a fingerprint. There has to be something that proves it. All right. The clue number 7, which for me is up to another level. How strange are the manuscripts of this friend, grand voyager of the unknown. And down here it says, the parchments of this friend were for me the thread of Ariadne. In other words, they were the thread that led me out of the labyrinth. All right, so let's keep this moving. If Jean Richer was the author of Le Serpent Rouge, then there's only one person who Cet Ami can be. It has to be Nerval, because Richer spent his life obsessed with Nerval. As he said before, the study of Nerval was what led him to be able to study the complex systems of landscape geometry. That's what he's saying here. The parchments of my friend, the writings of Nerval, were the thread of Ariadne, what led me out. How strange are the manuscripts of this friend. Indeed, Nerval's writing is strange. Grand Voyager of the Unknown. Richer even has a whole chapter on Nerval called The Noble Voyager. So he even calls him this very close Grand Voyager. So let me put it this way. This is a test. This is a test to see if Richer was the author. If Richer was the author, it has to be Nerval. If it's not Nerval, if we can crack this riddle we're going to see, then it can't be Richer. All right, so in the Pisces stanza, we have this friend. How could I present him to you? His name remains a mystery, but his number is that of a famous seal. His name remains a mystery, but his number is that of a famous seal. In French, son nombre est celui d'un sceau célèbre, a famous seal. His number is that of a famous seal. All right, that's the riddle that we have to solve to figure out who Cet Ami is. His number is that of a famous seal. Well, many people have tried this. So, okay, let's try the first part of it. How do we turn a name into a number? Well, that's easy, isn't it? A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, the standard code. You take someone's name, you just add up the letters and you produce a number. That part makes sense, okay? But what is the number of the famous seal? Well, what is a famous seal? Is it the seal of Solomon? Has that got a number? That hasn't got any number. So no one's been able to figure this out. Well, one day in 2008, it was end of summer, it was a hot summer day, and I was walking from Far to Esperanza. It was a delightful day, and I was turning this problem over in my mind. And I thought, what is the famous seal? The number of the famous seal. And then suddenly I had an idea. Wait a second. What if it's not some famous seal that's got a number associated? What if it's the number of the words un sceau célèbre? What if it's his number is that of un sceau célèbre, the number of un. In other words, if I get un sceau célèbre and I find A equals 1, B equals 2, write it out, what will that add up to? And will that add up to the same as Gérard de Nerval? Well, I couldn't wait to get home. I didn't run, but I was walking as fast as I could. And when I got home, I got out my notebook and I wrote it out. Gérard de Nerval, 7, 5, 18, 1, added it up, 134. Okay. Then I wrote out un so célèbre, add up the numbers. Okay, this is a magic moment, isn't it? Because if this number is anything else than 134, then the whole theory is no good. But it is 134.
Wow.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. The next thing I did was check it 5 times before I then went nuts. Judith arrived 20 minutes later, I couldn't wait to tell her. She then went nuts. And we still recall it to this day, the day I solved Un so célèbre. What makes this solution so satisfying, besides it being a perfectly formed riddle, is that the trick itself adds an additional layer of confirmation. As I noted, Nerval was obsessed with this idea of arithmosophy, the idea of turning names into numbers to explore their symbolic value. Richer, in fact, has a whole chapter in his 1947 book on Nerval entitled Arithmosophy, and even Richer himself uses such calculations in his own writings. So the use of arithmosophy to conceal the name of cet ami is itself an identifying fingerprint of the work of both Richer and Nerval.
Wow.
All right, so as far as I was concerned, the key had fit in the lock opened, the door has opened, and we're now into the castle. We've been stuck in the car park, in the gravel car park for 60 years, but now we're going in to the inside. But wait a sec, okay, look, this is all great, but how could nobody have noticed this before? Come on, how could this be the case? Surely someone's noticed it. Come on, how could there be no record of this after all these years and everyone poring over it? Surely they didn't leave any record of this, otherwise people, well, let's have a look, shall we? The testimony of Plantard and the team. Well, I call them the team. Everyone else calls them the Priory of Sion, and that's fine, but I don't, like maybe they are, maybe they're not. I don't know. I call them the team. As I said before, I consider them literary, esoteric, high concept pranksters. Well, here is the 3 guys who are at the heart of the pranksters. On the left, Pierre Plantard. In the middle, Gérard de Sède and Philippe de Chérici. And there were certainly others involved, but these were really the 3 main guys. Now, Pierre Plantard, of course, plenty's been written, but I don't really think I need to add anything. I think the picture of the face pretty much tells you everything that you might need to know about Pierre Plantard. We'll just leave that there. My favourite guy is Gérard de Sède. He was a writer. He was very interested himself in symbolist poetry. And here he is pictured with the Occitan flag. He actually wrote many books, and they're really fine books. So he's the guy that wrote the 1967 book, L'Or du Rennes, which launched the story of Saunier and Rennes-les-Châteaux and the treasure. He was essentially hired to write it by Plantard, if you like. If you judged his output just on that one book, you would think that he wasn't much chop, but in fact his books are fantastic, and they're on the history and the culture of France, and particularly of the South, and they're excellent. Now this is the book that came out immediately before his book on Rennes-les-Châteaux. This is Le Trésor Cathare. This came out in 1966, actually at the start of 1967. This is all about Toulouse and the south of France. And it's an amazing book. It's about the Cathars, it's about the troubadours, it's about the landscape, it's about architecture. It's a really superb book of French history. So I think Gérard de Sède is a better writer and historian than perhaps he's ended up with a reputation. Philippe de Chérici was the third. He was also a writer. After his involvement in the whole Rennes-les-Châteaux thing, he went back to children's TV, I think. But these were the guys that launched the series of Dossier Secret in the 1960s, particularly with Pierre Plantard, and he was up to something, but okay. Now, let's go back to this book. So Pierre Plantard is obviously at the centre of this whole thing. So really, if Le Serpent Rouge was written by Jean Richer, did he leave any evidence of that? Well, this book, as I said, this is the 1978 book reprint of Langue, Celtique with the introduction by Pierre Plantard that nobody's seen. Now, sandwiched between the introduction essay, which is nutty nonsense to be frank, and the facsimile of Boudet's book, there's 20 or 30 pages in which he's put together a bibliography. No one ever refers to this, no one's ever reprinted this. This is an unknown part of the canon of Rennes-les-Bains books. So he's made 15 or 20 pages of books that he says, these are books that Boudet may have consulted, or these are other books that you might like to consult, or these are other books that have bearing on Boudet's book, Vraie, Celtique. All right, and on the very first page, this page here, he has a paragraph at the start before the bibliography starts. A short paragraph to the addresses to the reader. In my view, this is the most important page in the entirety of the Rennes-les-Bains canon, because it gives the game away. And here it is. He says, just telling you, okay, elements for a bibliography of the affair. The majority of titles here, yeah, well, they're going to be of some interest, but I have included a few more of general interest, including La Géographie sacrée du monde grec de Jean Rocher, the very book that I was reading here, that I've been reading all along, that the reader, on which the curious reader may meditate with profit. Well, that's fascinating. With 15 pages, Jean Rocher. Now you might say to me, well, look, he probably didn't even read it himself. It's just he has plucked one off the top. It's just a general book on ancient Greek. Is that right? Well, unfortunately, we can deal with that straight away because, and now there's the next book I want to show you. This, again, wonderfully rare book, Un vol à cinq pattes. Now this is the book, the testimony of de Chérizy, Philip de Chérizy, the third of our team. This was published in 2006 in a small, I think there's only a couple of hundred copies printed, and it consists of this long manuscript that he wrote all about his involvement in the Rennes-les-Bains mystery, and it's a handwritten facsimile. In the first half of the book, they've actually typed it out for you. So, again, I bought this book in the bookshop at Rennes-les-Bains. You rarely see it. I don't think if you tried to get hold of a copy, it'd be very difficult too. But here, and this is after his death, he's spilling the beans. And in the middle of this, we find 3 or 4 pages where he devotes himself to talking about Jean Rocher and Jean Rocher's involvement in the affair, and specifically Jean Rocher's involvement with Boudet, Vraie, Langue, Celtique. 3 or 4 pages, and he begins with this astrological geography, he calls it. Now he cites Plantard's quotation that we've just read. We did not hesitate to include sacred geography of the Greek world in our list. The curious reader can meditate on it to advantage. Now look what de Chérizy then says. This advice, which appears at the beginning of Elements for a Bibliography, marks the work of Jean Rocher as a very special case. No, I put it very in. As a special case. And serves notice that there is a certain situation here. Let's read that out again. It marks the work of Jean Rocher as a special case and serves notice that there is a certain situation here. That's incredible. And then he goes on to say this. Long before 1978, one saw tourists in Rennes-les-Bains consulting in the street a hardback book recognisable by its blue cover engraved with gold letters. Well, when I read that, I thought, well, what's he talking about? What's that book? Come on, what's that book? What does he mean? What's that book? I've got to find out what that book was. Well, it took me a while, but eventually I managed to track down a first edition copy of Jean Rocher's Géographie sacrée du monde grec. And there it is. It's the blue book with the gold letters. There it is. The blue book with the gold letters. Now, let's go slowly here because you might say, well, is that actually blue? It looks a little bit green to me. Well, look at this. Bibliothèque des Guides Bleus, the blue guides. Now, this is a quirky thing. This book was published in 1967 by Hachette, who's one of the biggest publishers in France, indeed the world. But they didn't publish it under the normal Hachette imprint. They published it under their Guide Bleu series, the Blue Guides. Now, the Blue Guides is it's Hachette's tourist guide subdivision. They produce, and they've done it for 100 years, and they're a staple of French life. The Blue Guides, you go to Tunisia, you buy the Hachette Blue Guide to Tunisia, and off you go. Well, over the years, Hachette have also published a few other books under this series. It's sort of almost like a French, like joke. Guide to medieval painting, as if it's a guidebook. And they chose to publish Richet's book under this Guide Bleu. So in fact, de Charassy is making a very funny joke here. There's a lot going on. But one of the things is a joke. He's saying that before 1978, you could see tourists consult. He brings it up in this introduction. He talks about the Zodiac of Rennes-les-Bains, and he associates it with Boudet's cromlech. Now, before 1978, that phrase never occurs anywhere in any Rennes-le-Château literature, the Zodiac of Rennes-les-Bains. The first time it's in this book. But here's de Charassy years later saying, no. Way before 1978, you could see people in the streets of Rennes-les-Bains walking around with this book. Well, I'll say those people were Gérard de Sède, Plantard, de Charassy, and Jean Rocher walking around with this book, and Jean Rocher was teaching them all about it. Because on the face of it, this makes no sense. If you came across this and you hadn't known this book, you can really understand what's so unusual about this. But this is what's unusual. This book is only about one topic: landscape zodiacs. That's all. This book of Richer's. It's the only thing, the only topic, landscape zodiac. So if someone is using this as a guidebook for Rennes-les-Bains, well, that makes no sense at all unless there's a zodiac at Rennes-les-Bains. And that's what he's telling you here. He's telling you that we were there way before Plantard started talking about it. We were there with Richer's book in the streets because Richer's book's about zodiacs, and there's a zodiac here. There's more, a bit more from Philip de Charassy. The appeal of Jean Rocher's investigation lies in the simplicity of the subject. It involves applying a zodiac on the Greek world map and using this fact that every zodiac is an oriented circle. More than a book which just makes you think, sacred geography of the Greek world entices the reader to a deeper reflection and to how it relates to Vraie, Langue, Celtique. And then, he says, the brilliant reconstruction of the cromlech zodiac by the author of the preface, Plantard, makes it possible to see that, in fact, the structure has tilted as suggested by Jean Rocher. Now look, I'm sorry to waste your time tonight. We could have started here and just forgotten about the last hour and a half, because everything I've been struggling to put this comprehensive proof together is conveyed right there. De Charassy's not even holding back. Jean Rocher was the guy who taught us everything about Vraie, Langue, Celtique, and the cromlech is a zodiac. What about the others? Well, actually, Gérard de Sède is the one who leaves the most comprehensive information. There's a lot more of this in my book. Everything's in my book. De Sède is a bit more complex to track the textual history, but here's a book that de Sède produced a few years later, and it's about Saint-Emilion, which is the wine centre up near Bordeaux. So he's written a book about the history of Saint-Emilion, and in the book, he's got this diagram, which is the Zodiac of Saint-Emilion. So he doesn't hesitate to get a local French village, put a zodiac on it, and then talk about it as if it's the most normal thing in the world to do. So de Sède was certainly in on it. So, the 1967 book by Gérard de Sède, L'Or du Rennes, which launched the Rennes-le-Château mystery, had a second title, The Accursed Treasure of Abbé Saunier. And then, 10 years later, it was reissued again, and here it is again, with a different title again. And the title is Signé Rose plus Croix. Signed Rose plus Cross. What? What does that mean? This is Asmodeus the Devil from Rennes-le-Château. Why did de Sède re-release his book on Rennes-le-Château with the title Signed Rose plus Cross? All right, well, it's almost as if these guys left a trail of clues. Seriously, for someone to come along and put together. All right, are you with me? Here's yet another book by de Sède. It's called La Rose Croix. Now, this has nothing to do with Rennes-le-Château at all. It's off on other topics. It's about Bacon is Shakespeare and all various other things. Funnily enough, it opens with two quotes, one by Goethe and one by Nerval. So it was as if de Sède was sort of leaving this sort of sprinkle of breadcrumbs. But in the middle of it, there's this incredible drawing here, which I've just gone past. This drawing here, which just appears out of the blue in the middle of this book. Now, it's called The Rose of the Winds on the Cross of the Seasons. So the Rose of the Winds is the 12-fold zodiac, and the cross of the seasons is the cross like that. So he's given you a picture of a zodiac on a cross, and he's called that the rose and the cross. Well, that's why he's called that book Signed Rose plus Cross. He's telling you that the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery is signed by a zodiac on a cross, the rose plus the cross. All right, we're getting to the weeds now. Let's keep going. This is an interview that was online by this guy called Gino Sandri, who purports to be the secretary of the Pride of Sion after Plantard died. Whether he is or not, I don't know, but this is what he said. He talked about Gérard completing the drafting of the book. Then he said he became acquainted with René Descadéus, who also published a work on Rennes-le-Chateau, and who'd been in contact with Pierre Plantard for several years. Enthusiastic and impassioned for a long time, Gérard de Sède put an end to his association with Plantard, and worked with young collaborators like a Parisian professor. This is an online interview from 2003. The guy's telling you, an insider, he's telling you that Gérard de Sède quit with Pierre Plantard and had a collaboration with a Parisian professor. I wonder who that is. He also says, the same year a small work with Serpent Rouge is copyrighted. The contents of this small work are certainly delirious, but there remains a somewhat interesting basis for it. Well, indeed. Well, who was the professor? Well, let's now look at Jean Richet himself. Did he leave any evidence that he was involved? Well, this is Jean Richet's follow-up book to Sacred Geography of the Ancient World. This is 1970. Jean Richet is called Delphes, Delos et Cumus, and it's part of a series called Places and Gods, collection dirigée or directed by Gérard de Sède. Look at that. And this book is published in Juilliard, which is where all the rest of de Sède's books are published, not at Hachette, where Richet was previously published. So, Richet's follow-up book, De Géographie Sacrée of the Greek World, was published in conjunction with Gérard de Sède himself. There's the two names brought together, and for the first time, Jean Richet's name appears in print with one of the team members. So there they are 3 years later, collaborating, just as Gino Sandri said in that 2003. Well, it turns out that Jean Richet indeed had read Carl Jung. In fact, his books are littered with references to Carl Jung. In fact, here it is in Sacred Geography of the Ancient Greeks. A psychologist of the stature of Jung saw the hero as an image of the integrated man who contains in himself the 4 elements and the 4 cardinal points. That's exactly what we started off with Jung's idea. There is Richet repeating that same idea of Jung's from psychology and alchemy. And Richet then took the idea and applied it to the Greek heroes and the Greek myths and legends of the Greek heroes now moving across Greek. He reinterpreted these as bodies moving on zodiacs, sun and planet moving around zodiacs. So for Richet, the stories of Greek mythology were astronomical stories. They were stories about the heavens. So he said, for example, the elements of zodiac symbolism were pervasive throughout the ancient culture. Zodiac diagrams will act as keys to decoding or deciphering the hidden meaning of certain ancient texts. For example, the epic travels of various heroes of Greek mythology, when mapped as paths onto these landscape zodiacs, allows them to be read as a reflection of the journey of the sun through the planetary houses. There it is. That's in Geography of the Ancient Greeks. That is the Serpent Rouge. Here's the footnote where Jean Richet actually tells you, this is in one of his books on Nerval, we use the English edition of the work of Jung, Psychology and Alchemy, London 1953. So he actually credits it there and he tells you that he read the English version of it. The next footnote is to this page 350, which in this edition is the page 368 that I showed you early on, which has the expression, the clearest expression of Jung's idea. And so here he is referencing to that very page, which years before I had identified as the page that the author of the Serpent Rouge must have been obsessing over. And finally, amazingly, I didn't talk about a fire because we're going to leave a fire because we might come back to it. All right. So let's keep going now. This is part 2, the Zodiac. There's another thing that Richet notices about these zodiacs in the ancient world, and it's this, that quite often, either east or west of the central point, there's a place called Leukat, or a word similar to Leukat. Now, Leukat comes from the Greek meaning white. And Richet develops this whole chain of association that This is associated with the spring. The sun rising at spring, east-west, is the white light of the sun. So he says that quite often you'll find with these zodiacs a place name called Lucca, either due east or due west, and he gives half a dozen examples and he talks for several pages about this. So for example, here's his zodiac of the Iberian Peninsula. Here's his zodiac centered on Toledo, and this is in the sacred geography of the Roman world. And this line from Toledo, he extends over here to places in Italy over here called Lucca. See that? Lucca. Down here, there's also a place called Lucca, Acra Lucca here, and this is on the Aries part of the zodiac. So in the normal zodiac, Aries is normally on the spring equinox. There's an association between Aries, the spring equinox, and white. So in this case, there's two versions. There's the white here, and there's the white on Aries. In any case, he devotes half a chapter to this idea and identifies 5, 6, 7 of his zodiacs and shows that there's a place called Lucca, east or west. So, here's Rennes-les-Bains. If you go directly east to Rennes-les-Bains, you come to a place that everybody who lives here knows very well, Cap Luccat. Here's the map. The village is called Luccat. Here's the lighthouse of Cap Luccat. This is Luccat Beach. This whole area is called Luccat. It's directly due east exact of Rennes-les-Bains, which is extraordinary because we can imagine now Richer sitting there saying, well, let me check if the Luccat condition is met. Gets out his map, finds Cap Luccat directly due east of Rennes-les-Bains. So, you know, depending on how convinced you are that Richer has discovered something real here, this seems to me a piece of evidence which goes to suggest that this actually is another example of this real thing that he's found, these very strange ancient landscape geometries. Well, he's not the only person to talk about this. In the 1970s, another French guy, René Dumayru, brought out this book, Geography Sidereal, in which he talks about the sacred geography of the south of France, particularly Toulouse. And he says that there's a zodiac centered around Toulouse, and here's the illustration from the book describing it. There's some interesting associations. Here's Leo, and it's the Gulf of Leon, of course, here, which is nice. Here's Aquarius, and it's Aquitaine. So I don't push these things too far, but what I can say is that in the 1970s, someone was writing about this and putting a zodiac on the landscape around Toulouse. And here's another illustration from the book. He takes it a step further. Here's the Occitan cross. And he's bold enough to put the Occitan cross in the place of this zodiac. Now that's fascinating because the Occitan cross is a fourfold cross and it has these 12 golden balls in the corner. And so what he's saying is, oh look, the 12 golden balls are the zodiac. He's saying the Occitan cross, the heraldic blazon of Occitanie, has a hidden zodiac. You say, well, that's great, but I think we're starting to spiral out of control here because this is just some cheesy 1970s paperback. There isn't really a zodiac at the centre of Toulouse. That'd be ridiculous. But we'll get to that in a sec. But here's Gérard de Sède in the Treasure Catar talking about Toulouse. The keystone of all celestial architecture, the cross of the cardinal points sharing the rows of the zodiac, was also that of the architecture of the temples and the cities, built in the image of the sky. It was the lines of the decumanus marking the 4 doors of the circular temple, whose location, fixed on the ground by the augurs, was then ploughed to delimit the space of the city to be born. That was 1966. This sentence would not be out of place in Jean Rocher's Sacred Geography of the ancient Greeks. This sentence, to me, proves that these guys knew each other. Gérard de Sède could not have composed that sentence without already having a deep relationship, intellectual relationship with Jean Rocher. All right, well, here is the centre of Toulouse. This is the capital. Now, Toulouse is an amazing, famous city. It's more than 2,000 years old. And in the centre, this is the Marais, and this is the capital, this big square. And as you can see, in the centre, there's a giant Occitan cross that's been inlaid. Let's zoom in on it. There it is. It's actually a sculpture that was inlaid in 1997 into the very centre. Here's a picture, a lovely picture at night of the fun that you can have. And here it is, laid in with metal into the pavement, and the sculptor has marked each of the 12 golden balls with the sign of the zodiac. So in reality, in the centre of Toulouse is the Occitan cross with a zodiac mark on it, in the centre of the centre of the centre. And it radiates then out from the capital, it radiates out to Toulouse, and from Toulouse it radiates out over the whole south of France. So these dreams, these ideas have started to actually take concrete reality in the modern world. The whole thing is based on a practical system of fire tower signalling between high points. It goes back to the Celtic times, the Romans inherited. This is a diagram from a wonderful researcher, George Keys, where he maps out the connections between the Templar Chateau and the ancient chateau in the landscape that were used for sending messages between themselves. This network of fire tower signalling merges in with the other alignments that we've been talking about. Okay. New topic. Meridians. One of the verses says, look for the line of the meridian in going from the east to the west. Then, looking from the south to the north, at last, in all sense, you will find the looked for solution. Meridians. Well, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm going to just report these discoveries, but this is what started the journey for me back in the 90s when I started looking at Henri's work. I discovered meridians in the mountains, and this is the first one I discovered. I discovered 4 local high points. This is a little hill here. This is La Pique, a famous local landmark. And these are 2 crests, and these are the highest points of the crest. You can stand here, you'll see these mountains lined up. There are meridians marked in the landscape. You can actually see it. This is from the summit of that top one. Here's La Pique, and here's the highest point of these 2 ridges. This is Le Serpent Rouge, the top. I found this one, I was elated, but then half an hour later I found a second one. This is 10 mountains in a perfect straight line going through Pescado. Remember, Pescado is actually called, Cardo is meridian. There is actually 2 meridians going through Cardo. One of them is the original Cardo axis of Rennes-les-Bains, but there's also a true north-south axis that passes through the 10 mountains. I could talk about this all night, but this is one of the most extraordinary things in the landscape here, and I wrestle every day with what's going on. Here's an actual picture of it. This is from the south flank of Cardo, looking to the south. The highest mountain is Peche en Carabatets, and the line runs through here. This is the next one, next one, next one. Here's a V-shaped indentation which it runs through. This is the point here. This is one of the points on the meridian. It passes where this road crosses over the crest. The road's been there for thousands of years. The meridian crosses exactly at that point. All right, so I'm kind of speeding through this. You'll see where it's heading. But these are the first 2 meridians I found back in the 90s, and I've added the 45-degree line that we saw before. Here's Rennes-les-Bains. So the meridians run through the same place as these other alignments run through. All right, stick with me. This is all going to make sense in a second. But they weren't the end of it. I found 3 more meridians in between the first 2. There are 5 meridians here running through this valley. They're all perfect. For example, La Val-Dieu is on the same meridian as Chateau Puy-Laurent down here. Chateau Bézu, when you consider, passes through 3 churches and 2 mountains, all the way down into the Pyrenees. These are 5 perfect meridians, north-south lines marked in mountain peaks. Now here's a video, and we're going to have a little fly over them. We're going to fly from north to south over the field of the meridians and have a look at this. So here's Pescado, here's Rennes-les-Bains and the entrance. And you just get a feel for how close they are and how this extraordinary series of 5 meridians cross this same area that we've been talking about, where we've already found this zodiac. Here we are now getting up into the higher peaks. Here are the 2 peaks on the La Pique meridian, the highest points of the 2 ridges. Here's Puy-Laurent, here's Peche en Carabatets, which is the largest mountain when you look to the south. And here's the incredible Bézu meridian going up the next valley. Church at La Pradelle, church at Salvezine, 2 mountains, and then finally the church at Montfort-sous-Boulzane, right up in the mountains. These are all perfect. You can mark them on the map, draw the lines. It's exactly 180 degrees. They're all perfect. All right. So, Geographic cryptography, Boudet's map. Let's go back to Boudet's map. We're on the home stretch now, folks. De Sède, in his introduction to the 1978 edition, says this about Boudet's book and the map. He says, the book, Vraie, Langue, Celtique, at first sight ridiculous, is in fact a work of geographic cryptography. That is why it includes a map of the region. Okay? Boudet's book is a work of geographic cryptography. That's why it includes a map. Therefore, the map is the work of geographic cryptography. Here's the map. All right, let's have a good look at it. This is the map that's baffled people for 100 years. And again, it's the Plantard version. Now, the first thing we notice about this map is it's completely hopeless because it doesn't have any of the normal things that a map needs to have. It doesn't have a grid. It doesn't have a scale. So without a grid and without a scale, you don't know where it is and you don't know how big it is or what, it's hopeless. So it's an incompetent map. Something is missing from the map. But there's something that's there that's kind of sticking out and kind of shouldn't be there. And that's this weird title at the top. See this Rennes-les-Bains. Just have a look at that for a second. That's it. Have a look at that. It's weird, isn't it? Weird letters. And what's it doing there? Stuck up there. It's weird. All right, so De Sède says that the cryptogram requires a key. That with the key, you can unlock the cryptogram. And he also says that the key is hidden within the work itself. Like he gives you all these clues. All right, so it's a cryptogram. There's a key. The key is hidden somewhere within it. Well, I decided I wanted to practice. One day, I happened to measure this word Rennes here, and I happened to have a ruler marked in inches, English inches. And I measured this word, and it turns out to be exactly 2 inches long. Well, that's interesting. Then I measured how high it was, and it's exactly half an inch long, half an inch high. Well, that was interesting. Maybe the key is the inch. Inch, that's pretty weird, isn't it? Because it's not, they don't use the inch in France. In fact, it's illegal since Napoleon to use the inch in France. France uses the metric system. That's kind of a funny thing. But it's not 50 millimeters and 25 millimeters, or 12.5. It's 50.8, and it's 2 inches and half an inch. So I thought, all right, okay, let's say that's the key. What happens if I use that as the basis of a grid, and I rule in that 2 and then I extend those lines across, so I make a grid of these half inches, all right? I rule the top line, bottom line, continue that grid that way, inch line, continue that. What happens if I do that? Is that the answer? Let's have a look. All right, there it is. That's what happens when you impose a half-inch grid on the map. Now, I want to point something out. Remember I said earlier that there was 2 different versions of the map, and there's differences between them. The first difference is that Plantard's version has a border around it, which is missing from the De Sède version, which everybody has in the facsimile they bought. Nobody has this version of the map, and it's got this border. And look what happens here on the edge of this. The grid exactly falls on that left-hand border, exactly. And then the more you look, the more that you realise that the writing itself also falls in line with the grid. In fact, when you divide the squares into 1/12 of an inch and you expand it up, this is what happens. Look, this is the tiny writing down the bottom of the map. It's exactly on this grid, exactly. All the writing is formed as if the grid is there and the person has meticulously written it on the grid and then erased the grid. So, as surprising as that sounds, I put it forward that the key is the inch, and with the inch you unlock the secret grid. Now, that can't be right, surely. Well, let's look at some clues that Gérard de Sède mentions in his essay. He points out that Boudet refers to this local landmark near Rennes-les-Bains. It's a rocking stone. It's not there anymore. I believe someone smashed this stone, but it used to be this wonderful stone that would naturally rock. Boudet, in his book, calls it les rouleurs. And de Sède points out that nobody else has ever called that stone rouleurs. It's got a name and it's not rouleurs. It's never been on any map as rouleurs. It makes no sense that he's called it rouleurs. But remember that the whole point of Boudet's book is that, the crazy point is that all languages have their origin in English. So, de Sède says, and this is a quote, let us look up what ruler means in English. Because Boudet's called attention to this word ruler, because everything has to be taken back to English, Let us look up what ruler means in English, says de Sede. Well, what is a ruler in English? It's a ruler marked in inches, isn't it? In the very next phrase, he says, let us next examine the letters of the inscription with a magnifying glass. Well, that's what happens. When you take a ruler, an English ruler, and inspect with a magnifying glass, that's what you find. Even de Cherasy in this book, he tells you that there's a hidden grid in Boudet's map. No one's noticed him tell you that. He gives these instructions on how to draw it, but he's transposed one word. He uses centimetres. Well, when you follow it makes no sense with centimetres. But everywhere he says centimetres, you would replace that by ½ inch. Then his instructions work out perfectly, and the grid that he describes fits exactly on the grid that I've found. In fact, you can see on that previous map, he had the 2 lines of Rennes-les-Bains, and there they form in that part of the grid. Can you see that? They're the two, that's the built-up area of Rennes-les-Bains, and you're saying they're going to fall in the middle of those 2 lines. And there they are. All right, so we're nearly there now. I want to present 1 or 2 more results now. In many ways, this is, for me, the most extraordinary result of all. So I discovered these meridians. Okay, I claimed they're there, but I realised this is a pretty wild claim. Meridians in the mountains, what are we talking about? But I've zoomed in on them here they are. So now I've found the grid in Boudet's map, so it's occurred to me, well, what is the relationship between the vertical grid lines on Boudet's map and the meridians? Is there any relationship? Is it possible that Boudet's map with the grid refers to these meridians? Well, let's find out. I took Boudet's map, I very carefully adjusted it to the correct size for Google Earth, and then I superimposed it. Here are the 5 meridians, and I want you to concentrate on the inner 3. Right, there it is, lined up. Here's the inner 3 meridians that I found from my research that I wrote about in the late 90s. And here they are the exact meridians, grids, vertical grid lines on Boudet's map. I still can't get over that. Every time I load this slide, I expect to see it differently, and I literally cannot get over this. Right, now, let's take it one step further. Stick with me, we're nearly done. Consider these 2 meridians here. This is the meridian of Val-d'Ur, and this is the meridian through Bézieux. Consider that on this grid map, they're separated by 2 squares. The squares are ½ inch. So they're separated by 1 inch. All right, they're separated by 1 inch on Boudet's map. Well, how does that translate to the landscape? Well, to do that, we need to know the scale of Boudet's map. Again, it's not marked on it, but we can work out what it is. We can pick 2 points, we can measure them, we can compare. And it turns out that the scale of Boudet's map is 1 to 25,000. By coincidence, exactly the same as the IGN map that we all use today. It just happens to be that way. 1 to 25,000. So, if the distance on the map between these 2 meridians is 1 inch, and it's a 1 to 25,000 scale map, then in a landscape, the distance between these 2 meridians is 25,000 inches. And it is. Exactly. And between the next 2 meridians, the meridian through Bézieux and the meridian through Rennes-les-Bains, there's 3 squares. So it's just 1.5 times. It's 1.5 inches on the map. And it's 37,500 inches in the landscape. And it's exact, and it's precise, and it works. You can get Google Earth, you can drop your thing there, and it's exactly. So it's hard enough to believe that there are 5 meridians marked in mountains, but now I'm going to ask you to believe that they are actually separated by exact whole number measures in English inches. Now, I don't blame you if you can't accept that, because I can barely accept myself 2 decades after. All right, so let's start winding it up now. Let's wind up all the loose ends. So Boudet's cromlech. What was Boudet's cromlech? What was he going about? Okay, well, it's a zodiac, but there's one point in the description where he gives a surprisingly accurate dimension of his cromlech. He says that the cromlech is a circle of 16 or 18 kilometres in circumference. He doesn't say approximately 16 or 18. He doesn't say, he says 16 or 18 kilometres in circumference, which is a sort of an odd thing to say about a stone circle which doesn't even exist anyway. So, all right, but let's just take it at face value. I have now drawn on Google Earth 2 circles, one of circumference 16 kilometres, one of circumference 18 kilometres. The obvious question that occurs is, okay, what happens then if we put these on Boudet's map? What would happen then? Because presumably his map must have some relationship to this cromlech. So what happens when we draw, let's just take the first one, the 16 kilometres. What is the size of a 16 kilometre circumference circle when drawn on a 1 to 25,000 scale map? And when you do the numbers, amazingly it works out that the radius is exactly 4 inches. Now, it's a little bit more, it's like 4.01, it's within a hundredth of an inch, which is too small for the human eye to see. So let me just state the result. Boudet's cromlech circle of 16 kilometres, when represented on a 1 to 25,000 scale map, is accurately represented by a 4-inch radius circle. There it is. And so, centred on Rennes-les-Bains, it neatly sits within an 8 by 8 square, because these are inch squares. Well, when I see an 8 by 8 squares, I have to just colour them as a chessboard, because that's pretty obviously what it is. The second one, 18 kilometres, actually becomes a 4.5 inch radius circle. So when you draw the two circles, they actually meet exactly on the grid lines. Now, I don't know at what point we're getting to the point where Boudet intended this or didn't intend that, but remember the drawing by Oswald Wirth? Discover one by one the 64 stones. Well, I'll take that. The 64 stones is the chessboard. And in fact, there's a rich tradition of the earth being constructed out of chessboards. The Indians have a word for it, ashtapanda. They consider that the world is made up of ashtapanda, which is a grid system. This is an illustration from Lewis Carroll, Through the Looking Glass. Nothing to do with René Chateau. But he's rendered the landscape as a grid of black and white squares. So the poem itself, Le Serpent Rouge, talks about the black and white squares of the mosaic place. So, I don't know, that's starting to get a little bit speculative, but I think this is kind of interesting. So let's draw it together now. There appears to be an ancient landscape format around Rennes-les-Bains. It combines the Cardo Decimanus axis with the Zodiac and these meridians. Somehow, knowledge of this format has managed to be transmitted through time and been preserved and come into the possession of Boudet. Now, he's the priest of the village. Maybe this knowledge was passed down from priest to priest. I have no idea. But Boudet decided to encode this knowledge as far as he had it in his map using this cryptographic technique. Time passed, 100 years later, Richer rediscovered the Zodiac. He read Boudet's book. He wrote Le Serpent Rouge. So what is Le Serpent Rouge? Well, it's the forestry trail on the flank of Pescado. It's also the entire path itself, the Sentier Rouge, the red path. It's also Pythia, the giant serpent, tutelary spirit of Delphi. And actually, that is something I forgot to mention, that in Richer's follow-up book, he actually has a whole passage where he talks about Pythia, the serpent, who was the guardian of Delphi. Eventually, she hands over the guardianship of Delphi to Apollo in this great myth. But he talks about this, and he uses language which is the very same language that turns up in Le Serpent Rouge describing the serpent. And you can see here the actual quotes. I haven't got them detailed, but literally the actual words from here then appear in Le Serpent Rouge. And Richer takes them from this ancient Greek text called the Homeric Hymn to Apollo. So he's tying in the ancient history of Delphi, the battle between Apollo and the python, serpent, into the story. It's also the path of the sun as it passes through the Zodiac, as he said in that first sentence from his book. And then by extension, by analogy, it's the path of the hero as he moves around the landscape as a Zodiac. So the Serpent Rouge has this multifaceted symbolism. So where did Richer get that statement from on the first page of his book, that the sun, the serpent, is a symbol of the sun passing through the signs of the Zodiac? Well, he got it directly from Jung in Psychology and Alchemy. There it is. Jung says, now the serpent not only is a symbol of the earth, but also represents the path of the sun through the Zodiac. And that's exactly what Richer says on the first page of his book. Well, here's two more quotes of Richer just to finish it off. In his books on Nerval, at one point he says, all the grand cyclic poems of antiquity are based on a foundation of astral beliefs. In other words, the stars are behind all the legends. And then in another place he expresses it this way: the masterpieces of universal literature have zodiac structures, which is the whole thing in a nutshell. Final question. What about those mysterious deaths of the three authors? What the heck was going on there? Well, here's the thing. Gérard de Nerval is an amazing writer. He's got an amazing life. I would have liked to talk more about him today, but there's a lot to be spoken of. But in many ways, Nerval is the hero, although he has, of course, nothing to do with Rennes-les-Bains mystery, nothing to do with the production of the poem, and yet it's his spirit that shines through what Richer did in the poem. Now, Nerval met a sad and untimely death in 1855 in January, cold winter's night, foggy night, in a small alleyway by the Seine. He had a moment of madness. He had bouts with madness his whole life. He was in and out of sanitation in institutions. And a moment of madness, he hung himself. January 26, 1855, he was found the next day. His funeral was hugely attended. He was well loved. He had many, many friends. But in his death, he became one of the archetypes of the SHO that he wrote about. He became the hanged man. And there are people who write about his life, and Richer writes about it, specifically associating him with the hanged man because that is the way he chose to go out. So now finally we can put the last piece of the puzzle together. There was Plantard sitting with the manuscript of the Serpent Rouge, waiting to put it into this pamphlet and release it. It was mid-March 1967, and news came to his ears, who knows where, from the newspapers or from his contacts in Paris. He heard about these 3 deaths by hanging. And he had an appalling idea. He thought, well, look, here's a way to put some macabre mystification around this and to tie it with Nerval. Nerval is the hanged man. Nerval is the archetype behind the poem. And these 3 men who hung themselves, wouldn't it be hilarious, thought Plantard, to attribute this poem to these 3 men because they were the hanged man? That's the little secret gag. So he did. He went ahead with the deposit slip. He backdated it. He went ahead. Well, then at some point, and this is all pure surmise, but I don't think it's too difficult to imagine, Richer then found out what had happened. And he would have been absolutely appalled at this ridiculous thing that Plantard had done. And he said, well, this is ridiculous. I don't have any more to do with you guys. I'm a respectable professor. This is all gone. This is already out of hand. I don't want anything more to do with you, and I don't want you mentioning my role in this. And who knows what mutual obligations they had between them, but for some reason, Richer was able to obtain from them a commitment to keep his name out of it, and they did. And so the whole Serpent Rouge thing became a mystery. When they all refer to it, they all sort of look the other way. No one seems to know who wrote it, but none of them could resist over the years leaving on record little clues as time went on, so that now we can actually go back and recreate and see what was happening. Well, let's leave the last word to Gérard de Sède. This is the final sentence of this magnificent book, Le Trésor Cathare, which came out immediately before the book on Rennes-le-Château. And this is the final sentence. Le seul trésor de l'homme est l'homme, et il est inépuisable. Man's only treasure is man himself, and he is inexhaustible. Well, what a great sentiment that is, and particularly coming from Gérard de Sède, who was then about to tell you about this accursed treasure of Rennes-le-Château. He was leaving on record. Look, he says, I don't care about the treasure. All this stuff is ridiculous about treasure. Man's only treasure is man himself, and he is inexhaustible. Well, French books are delightful because right on the last page they actually give you the actual date of publication. And the date of publication here, as given on the final page, is the 18th of January 1967. That's the very day after January 17th, 1967, the day of publication of Le Serpent Rouge. And that brings it all full circle and leaves the last word to Gérard de Sède. Well, all this is documented in my book, The Map and the Manuscript, which came out in 2022. Lots more, perhaps way too much, but lots more textual detail and other things in there as well. And thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate your listening tonight, and thank you so much.